Well, thank you all for turning out. I've known Polly for over 30 years. Slightly improbably, you may think, she had a stint at the Beeb before she came back to her natural calling of print, and is, by a mile, the best social commentator in British journalism in my lifetime. But she came to the Beeb, and the head of the Beeb said, "Your job is to make it work with Polly." And Polly left rapidly thereafter.
7 years.
But I had a good time. This is a fantastic book. It's a collision of a very large number of things. There is in it a huge amount of family history, a huge amount of social anger and indignation about injustice. There is terrific showbiz. There is glitz, glamour, stately homes, philosophers, artists, authors, and much else. But the central core of the book is about Polly's anxiety that having a social conscience and being concerned about the disadvantaged always puts you a nanosecond away from somebody saying you're a hypocrite because you have central heating and you drink a glass of wine and you have a roof over your head and you're not Mahatma Gandhi. So my opening question, Polly, is this book is in some ways agonizing about the potential charge of hypocrisy. How long have you been agonizing about agonizing before you decided finally to write a book about your agonizing about agonizing?
Well, I would say for many generations, and that's what it's about. It's about a family who've all been radicals, one kind or another, and all of them very uncomfortable and uneasy about living comfortably while fighting great campaigns for people deprived in one way or another, or just the nature of British class system. All of them, sometimes in comical ways, trying to find ways round it. How do you live comfortably with this inequality? I mean, you know, champagne socialist was something that David Cameron threw across the House of Commons at Ed Miliband. It's used all the time. I get it all the time on threads under my column. And so you are inevitably in a position, well, you know, if you care so much about the poor, why don't you give everything away? Well, you know, yeah, you should give away what you can. But it's no answer to a political movement how to make life more equal, to say, if everybody who's got anything gave it all away, it would all be fine. That would not be a very successful or useful political movement. Why isn't everybody Mahatma Gandhi? So I've gone through various elements of my family and the things that they've done and the campaigns they've fought and how they've lost and lost again. On the whole, they've always been regarded as sort of eccentric mavericks fighting corners. My great-grandfather was called Gilbert Murray. He was the Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford, and he was a teetotaler, a vegetarian, a passionate anti-colonialist, anti-empire, passionate about women's votes, women's rights, and kept standing. There was used in those days to be a seat at in Oxford. He kept standing to be the... he was a great home ruler as well for Ireland. And he would lose and lose again. And he would have be asked to speak in the Oxford Union on campaigns about pacifism or fighting for king and country, or campaigns indeed about the empire. And he would lose and lose again. And I think what I would say to them now, if they were alive, is the interesting thing is most of those campaigns were won. You were ahead of the game, but actually all of the things you fought for were won. True of my grandfather, who was Arnold Toynbee, who was a well-known historian, wrote 12 volumes of a huge book called Study of History about why civilizations rise and fall. I'm afraid I've only read the abridged version. And it's not much read these days. But again, tremendous campaigner, first for the League of Nations and then for the United Nations and for international peace. Great idealistic man. And again, he would have won quite a lot of his battles. But the one that, and then my father, who was a communist up until the war, and then when it came to the Hitler-Stalin pact, like a whole lot of people who were communists then left the Communist Party, but stayed very much on the left and was a founder of CND. And he looked for his own way to try and reconcile a middle-class life. He was a literary critic on The Observer and a poet and a writer. And in the end, he came up with the worst idea of all, which was to set up a commune in his house. And he said, right, I can share everything equally amongst everyone. He was a very keen digger and gardener and vegetable garden and allotment. We'll all do digging and we will all live on the vegetables. So he made the mistake putting advertisements in the alternative press asking people to come and join his commune. And they arrived in droves. He was at that point quite old himself. He divided his house up into little cubicles. They all came and lived there for a bit, but it became a sort of crash pad. And he'd be the only one out there digging. When he was looking for the rest of them, they were doing primal screaming out in the woods, and he'd say, no, I'm sorry, we've got to go and meditate now. And he'd be the one doing all the digging. And in the end, it fell apart when a religious lunatic took over, and he had to give it up, and was then very depressed at his attempt to give everything away. In the end, he took it all back again. And as they left, they said, we knew you'd do that, landlord.
That's the plot spoiler. The commune is in the book, and it wasn't a great success. You've talked about, in the long run, your rather illustrious relatives might think that something had been achieved. But you don't feel that you've been on the winning side very much. It comes out in the book. And there are one or two issues in which you think not only have you lost, but things have got worse.
That's true. I mean, I would say to them they'd won most of their causes, but not the big one, not inequality in social class. I mean, they would have assumed in their lifetimes, my lifetimes, and when I was born after the war, from 1900, the story I was told in O-level history of social progress was the inevitability of social progress. Factory Act, trade union rights, increased franchise, getting more equal in terms of wealth and in terms of income. Welfare state hugely increased equality as well. And I just assumed, and that's the way we were taught, that this was the inevitability of progress forever until we get to the 1980s. And then everything stops. Everything goes into reverse. And ever since then, we've become more unequal. It's very shocking to me that birth is destiny, social destiny, more now than when I was born. It's gone backwards. Opportunity is less. Birth is destiny more than it ever was. And that's really what I'm writing about here. That's happened in my working lifetime. When I started off writing about, I was doing a lot in the 1970s about strikes and about certainly progress in terms of greater equality of income, partly due to the strength of the trade unions. When in the 1980s the trade unions were demolished, effectively, still there, but with very little power. When everything was outsourced so that people were working for agencies, gig economy got going, people no longer had security and certainly no longer had any heft in terms of what they were paid. The middle to the bottom from about the mid-1980s has been held down, either stagnated or fallen. And the lid came off the top, astronomical high earnings and high wealth at the top.
There isn't a single study that I know of the UK that disagrees with this. It's uncontroversial fact that social mobility has gone back. So one quick question, how does that compare with the rest of Europe? And then I'll just tee up the second question, which is that it's happened is not contentious. It's happened. There's less social mobility now than there was in the 70s. But why has it happened? So let's do the first one first, which is okay. How do we compare with Europe?
Well, we're worse than Europe, but we're not quite as bad as America. I mean, the odd thing about America is its whole foundational myth is anybody can make it from trailer park to White House, and it's become less and less true, and yet people still fundamentally believe it. Why would they elect people like Donald Trump if they didn't somehow believe that anybody could be Donald Trump? And the Europeans, less unequal than us, they've also become, even the Scandinavians, become more unequal during this time. But we are much the worst. We're parked sort of somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. And it's been very dramatic here, I think, socially for us, to move from an era where we felt that we were broadly social democratic with the welfare state in the war, and through conservative eras where Harold Macmillan built 350,000 council homes, social homes, a year during his time. We don't have conservatives like that anymore. There's been a dramatic change. But I think I would give a graphic example of why I know this is true. I wrote 2 books. When I started out in journalism, I was on a temp on the news desk of The Observer, and doing a lot of strike reporting, because that's what it was in those days. I sort of realised I was being sent around the country I knew nothing about. I'd lived in London, I'd been to Oxford, lived part of my life in Suffolk where my father lived, that was it. And I knew nothing about anybody else's life, really, except a middle-class intellectual world in which I was born. So I took time off and I went and took jobs around the country. I worked in Lucas's car parts factory in Birmingham. I worked in Unilever in Port Sunlight. I joined the Women's Army for a bit. I worked in a hospital in West London. I worked in a cake packing factory and a few others. And really I was just feeling my way and describing it, not very scientifically, talking to people, finding out what life was like, particularly what work is like. I wasn't finding out about abject poverty. I wanted to know what average, ordinary, manual work was like. And then I went and did it again, 33 years later. Labour was in, they'd got minimum wage, and I thought, I really need to go back and look again and see what's happened since the minimum wage. And so I then took a whole series. I did it much more scientifically. By this time, I'd been the social affairs editor at the BBC. I read a huge amount of social research. I'd done a lot of social reporting, and I knew much more what I was looking for. I was far more focused. And I took a flat about 10 minutes away where I lived at the posh end of Clapham, took a flat in one of the worst estates, which I could do because they were doing it up and they could lend it to me before they were letting it out again, and took whatever jobs I could get from the local job centre. And I got a job as a dinner lady, as a care home worker, as a carer in a care home, in the same West London hospital where I'd been before, that had been rebuilt now, in a nursery, and in a cake packing factory and a few others. The really useful thing was to go back to the same hospital. This gave me absolute tangible evidence that I could take my payslip from 33 years before and from now, take them to the Institute for Fiscal Studies and say, right, tell me what's happened to my pay in that time, in real terms. And they looked at the 2 payslips and said, you've lost about 1/3 of your income. And that's what's happened to people on ordinary manual wages, and mostly through the mechanisms which Thatcher brought in of outsourcing, in that I never found a job working for the state, where I was doing jobs that should be working for the state, like working in a hospital, but they'd been outsourced to an agency, working for another agency, working for Carillion, which had the contract for those jobs.
So, Mrs. Thatcher is the political instrument which arrests social mobility and puts very low interest and focus on anything that looks like the economic well-being of the disadvantaged. But it can't be the only answer, partly because she's been gone a long time, partly because the left has been in power during the Blair and Brown years for a period of that time. So why has it happened? And to what extent is the left itself to blame for the fact that it's happened?
Well, Labour did quite a lot in that it brought in the minimum wage, which certainly helped, and the minimum wage has risen quite a lot, and actually these Tories have raised the minimum wage because it's a cheaper way than paying out benefits, and it's a good thing to do. But Labour also, 1 million children out of poverty, 1 million pensioners out of poverty. They also, even if they didn't quite cross the line, the very poorest were all lifted up much closer to the poverty threshold. But the inequality statistics stayed the same, partly because of the mega rich. If you have a Gini coefficient that measures the nature of inequality, if you leave the very rich to get on with it, it still comes out very unequal. And they were very frightened of ever touching that at all. They were terrified of it. I'm hoping this time Rachel Reeves will be a bit braver about looking at the wealth and the incomes of the mega rich, because where else is there money to be found for all the things that need to be done?
Can I just try this out? Not that any of this is a bad thing, but a lot of left-wing concern, generalized statement, in the last 15 and 20 years has been focused on correcting historical group injustice. And injustices they are. Injustices about gender, injustices about race, injustices about sexuality. And shorthand, but identity politics, and I don't mean that as a bad thing. I mean people are entitled to have aspects of their identity properly recognized and respected. But the focus on that hypothesis on the left has been such that it may have sucked the energy out of the central concern in this book, which doesn't disregard all these other injustices. But the central concern of this book is about economic injustice. And the left's focus has been less on that than on these other things.
I think that's true. I think that, identity is very important. Obviously, race, gender, all of those things are incredibly important, but they intersect. And you get a sort of Venn diagram where the very worst is that, of course, if you are disadvantaged in a whole number of ways, you're going to be socially disadvantaged, you're going to be at the bottom of the heap. And you need to deal with all these different aspects and causes of inequality. But class is the big one. It overarches everything. Where you're born predestines you to such an extent. And obviously, race and other things come into that too. Geography comes into it. But I think unless you keep hold of the idea that class is really it, and opportunity and education opportunity. I mean, class is also education. If you get a bit of an educational leg up, you can escape. But that happens less and less now. Schools are, have fewer teachers and less funding and less opportunity for all the things that make a difference to children who don't have much stimulation at home. But I do think it's important not to get lost in the thickets of different types of inequality, and remember that the big one is social class.
If you go on as a self-respecting commentator or politician or any of those programs like Question Time or Any Questions on Radio 4, and you want to guarantee yourself a round of applause, you will say, I'm strongly in favour of equality of opportunity. And if you want a bigger round of applause, and this is absolutely true on the right as well as the left, you say, of course, I want Britain to be a functioning meritocracy, because that's what equality of opportunity means. And you read Polly's book, and you come out with the sense that equality of opportunity and meritocracy are not all they're cracked out to be. And I wonder whether you might expand on that.
Well, I wanted to write a book about being privileged. There are lots of lovely books about class, of people working their way up, or, wonderful books like Lem Sisay's autobiography about the hardest possible childhood in care, abandoned, and making his way gradually through all sorts of vicissitudes to becoming a great poet and a great writer. And there is, Lindsay Hanley writing a book called Estates about making it out of a working class estate in Birmingham. But I didn't really think anybody had said, if you want to understand about class, you need to understand the nature of privilege. And my family has always been privileged. I spent a lot of time looking to see if there was any branch or twig of working classness anywhere in my background. Not one. Not a root, not a branch. Everybody was there. I thought, there's one who's a governess, my great-great-grandmother. No, it turned out she was middle class, fallen on hard times, well-educated. And I think probably education more than money has been the thing in my family. My great-grandfather was a professor. My grandfather was a professor. His sister was a professor of archaeology at Cambridge. Their other sister, they thought rather inferior because she was only a don at Oxford. My stepfather was a professor. It's been the passing on of education and of educational aspiration, of intellectual life, of belief that intellectual life matters, that sets you up in life in, even more than money does. And the presumptions of class, just assume you could do whatever you want. Of course you can. You come from our sort of background, anything is possible. As opposed to people come from a background where they've never seen anybody do anything else, and they just assume that all of that is for other people, not for me. I mean, Keir Starmer said that in his rather good conference speech this year. He said, you know, in your ear, if you're working class, and he had it too, this general sense, that stuff's not for you.
Let me squeeze you a bit harder. I mean, you're quite close to thinking that meritocracy is a sham. It's a sham word. It's a bad word. It's used to cover a lot of sins. And this book is, there's another book written by the great American public philosopher Michael Sandel, which Polly quotes in this book. But it's your perception I want here of whether or not the moment you hear the word meritocracy used in political debate, you immediately reach for a duvet and scream, sham.
Yes, absolutely. The Michael Sandel book is just brilliant. Because, you know, a lot of the Tories at the Tory Party conference, you go to fringe meetings, they all want grammar schools back. They say things like, we've just got to get better at picking the diamonds from the rough. They have the idea of this massed rough and just a few diamonds, which, thank goodness, the comprehensive system, you know, in most places, but not everywhere, did away with the idea that you start with the rough and you look for the occasional diamond. The idea of meritocracy is that those who can pass these exams and pass these hurdles, it just seems to be a coincidence that they happen to be middle class, have had an awful lot of extra teaching. Even if they haven't been at private schools, they've had an awful lot of extra maths and English and other tuition to get them over these hurdles. Their parents have pushed them, have sat with them doing their homework. That is incalculable benefit, and it means, of course, it's not meritocracy. I asked a very good geneticist, a great expert, and I said to him, how much do you really think intelligence is heritable? Because a lot of the other right-wing thing is, well, of course, you know, there's an awful lot of inheritance in this. You come from a clever family, you're bound to have, you know, just as you might look like your family, of course. He said, well, there is probably some measure of it. It's hard to identify. There probably is, because other things are heritable. And he paused and he said, but not half as much as money.
I shouldn't leave you all with the thought that the book is only about Polly's massive frustration and anger about social injustice, although that is a very huge strand. It's quite an angry book in a very good way. It's also dripping with gossip and entertainment, and stately homes are banging into royalty. The word bang is not necessary. Stately homes and the aristocracy and rebels and all sorts of things are flowing through this. Polly, it's a great image, this. The woman who you see as a child was employed as a beater to ensure that the partridge hunt went well. But there's a sliding doors moment quite early in the book. Some of you may know this, but it's a very rich anecdote, and as it's in the book, I think it's okay to ask you about it, which is, you are partly responsible for Boris Johnson being Prime Minister, because had you behaved differently when Polly was not yet 21, who knows what might have happened. So I'm going to ask Polly to pick up the story when Polly sees Boris Johnson...
No, wait.
Stop.
I knew he'd ask this, because it's an enjoyable story, though not terribly relevant, but never mind, I couldn't resist putting it in. I was 17, having an affair with somebody really nice who was 18. He was going to Oxford, and I then got a scholarship to Oxford, and I was going to go too. And I got pregnant. His mother was a Catholic and said, you have to have this child and have it adopted by a Catholic adoption agency. And I was horrified by this. And she said, you know, his sister was at Oxford, had a baby, was actually a student at Oxford, was married at Oxford. She said, well, you can live like she does. You have a flat in Oxford, you can stay home and look after the baby while he goes out and be a student, and nothing about my career or what happened to me. So I went with him to visit his sister, and there on the bath mat on the floor was this fat, pink, 6-month-old baby, very noisy, kicking fat legs in the air, with a shock of golden hair. And he looks much the same now. There's really very little difference. He is the same person through and through. And I took a look at him and I thought, no.
You're to blame.
I was going to have an abortion anyway. I did have an abortion. I was always terrified his mother would tell on me because this was about a year before the Abortion Act came in.
Polly, if he'd been exposed to you, he would have turned out concerned about social justice, a decent, kind man. We would have been so well governed. Look, I'm going to throw it to all of you in a minute. I just want to ask you one last question. Imagine you're supreme ruler for the day, and you can do 1, 2, or 3 things, just simple things which you think will improve, not solve the whole world's problems, but improve the lack of social mobility and the extent of economic injustice in the UK. What is Polly Toynbee's 1, 2, 3 wishes for the world?
Well, if I asked you all around the room, everybody would come up with all sorts of good ideas. There are so many things that can be done in so many ways. But I would just choose for Labour to come in, realistic things, for Labour to come in. The first thing would be to immediately pay back the £20 that was taken off everybody on universal credit. What happened during COVID is that anyone on universal credit was given an extra £20. The numbers of children living in poverty already going up just dipped like that. And it just shows you £20. I don't know what it costs to be here, but I know £20 is nothing much to us. £20 a week made all the difference. And the moment they took it away again, it shot straight up again. So the first thing I'd do, just as a down payment on decency, is to give back that £20. Then you begin to look at reforming the entire social security system after. But the most important thing I would go back to is Sure Start. Labour set up 3,500 Sure Start centres, some of them fully rolled out, others still to go, in which every single family, right from the moment a child is born, registered with the Sure Start Centre. There was everything there to help families with new babies. The health visitor was there, the midwives were there, speech and language therapy was there for children who were not learning to speak well enough. Really good nurseries were there with really good teachers, not just 16-year-olds minding babies, but proper maintained nurseries with. And the idea was that every child, by the time they get to primary school, should be at more or less the same level, ready to learn. And if you arrive at primary school without that, you never catch up. You are immediately cast into, oh, you're one of the ones who's fallen behind, and you never catch up. And every year in school, you fall further and further behind. So and these were effectively swept away. There are a few left, and some very good councils managed just to keep them going. These were swept away by George Osborne's first 2010 budget, which cut so many things. But that's the thing I think that hurt most. These were hubs of community. They were used by middle class as well as working class families. They were hugely popular. The idea was that everybody would have one within pram pushing distance. And every child would kind of grow up together in the local community. And it really worked. And I would bring them back. Expensive, but every pound you spend on early years is worth much more than primary, is worth much more than secondary, let alone university.